Well, it's 2:01. We've all got our battery recharged and hopefully power's on and phones and devices are all back engaged, and actually had a awesome lunch. Glad there was a microwave that worked. Let's just get right to our agenda here. The next item on our agenda is the Utah State Instructional Material Commission. We have a little bit of a presentation and overview that we're gonna see, and so Director Huntsman and Education Specialist Griffin, I believe you two are taking this on, so I'll turn the time over to both of you.
Thank you, Chair. Director Jennifer Thronson of Teaching and Learning. Alan and I are here today to go over the instructional materials review process and inform the board of how the process works and to answer any questions related to that process. So I will take you through a slide deck to start, and then we will pause at the end for questions, in which Alan and I will be happy to field those questions and hopefully provide any greater clarity about the process. So first, just to kind of outline what we're talking about when we talk about instructional materials. In a board rule as well as in code, it is defined as instructional materials include these things that you see there on your screen. So I'll give you just a moment to read those. So it's a pretty broad representation, but also a narrow representation in terms of these are the types of materials that we review when we're talking about instructional materials. Specifically, we kind of go through a 5-step process. And so I'm going to walk you through each part of the process so you see how all the components work together, ultimately leading LEAs to look at their options, whether they use our resource or their own tools and resources or a combination thereof to make their own local decisions, as local context is of most importance. What works in one community in Utah may not be appropriate or usable in another community. And so when we're looking at it from a board perspective as staff, we're really looking at two things. Does it align with the law? Is it in compliance? And does it align well with our standards? Those are our two primary vehicles, which then leave the LEAs to look at their local context, anything specific that they really want to have in curriculum. So to start with step one, we'll kind of go through each of these steps in a linear fashion. Some of them happen concurrently, but in general, it's a pretty logical lockstep. Here's how this kind of operates. So step one, the publishers of the instructional materials submit their materials to our staff. And under Utah code, if they are material that they're seeking for primary use, which is how it's defined in code, that this is kind of a core instruction material, then they are required to have an independent summary of how well their curriculum aligns with our standards. And that has to be outside of the actual publisher, but provided by somebody else who looked at our standards, who looked at their materials and said, here's how well your product aligns with Utah standards. So just to kind of hit on the code piece that is required for any published materials that a publisher wants to say, we want these considered for core instructional use, or what we call primary instruction. The step one further on with the publisher submissions is basically we look at what they submit through our instructional materials database and make sure that the data is correct. Then we provide access to all parts of those instructional materials for the review. So we take everything they submitted. In the last couple of years, everything's been digital submissions. In prior years, we actually had mailings of materials that would come in, and our staff would sort those and put them on shelves and hand them out to the educators reviewing. So depending on the circumstances, the type of material, if we either get it in our hands or digitally, everything is provided in the space of review. And they tell us what those materials, what curriculum area they would like them considered for. So they might be submitting an English textbook or a social studies material. They're very clear about the curriculum area that material is expected. Once we have all those materials, our staff organizes our Utah educators to attend to those two primary objectives that I started with. One, does it align with our standards? And two, is it in compliance with the law? And so our Utah educators are pulled from the community. We reach out to our directors in the content areas and others to say, who would you recommend to do these reviews? We have those experts in those curriculum areas come either virtually or face-to-face to do those reviews, to go through the process and looking for these two pieces of the puzzle. Do they align with our standards, and do they meet the law? So furthermore, with the Utah educators, they are provided with rubrics to evaluate those instructional material reviews. Specifically, those rubrics cover content. There's some specific criteria, and the rubrics were in your board backup, so you've hopefully been able to review those. Accessibility, how accessible are those materials to who might have a disability or other accessibility pieces. Pedagogy, pedagogy also hits on our board rule later around R27328 to ensure that it's not biased and has some of those pieces. And finally, there are some content-specific rubrics, especially in the core content areas such as ELA, math, and science, that really go deeper into the instructional standards, but also the practices associated with the shifts in those standards. So with that said, those are kind of the rubric pieces, and you have all of those in your board backup. And then on the right side are they, once they've done those reviews, they've looked at the rubrics, they followed those protocols, they've considered the law and the standards. Then they're also, as they're doing the review, generating narratives to describe the desirable and undesirable features of the curriculum they're reviewing. And they're verifying that standards alignment. So we trust yet verify the alignment that the publishers give us, that they had to conduct through an independent partnership, but we want to make sure that that's true and accurate. And so our reviewers also do another verification of standards alignment. So those are the two main things that our educators are really operating upon. Then they're going to designate, based on their review, where they feel the curriculum fits. So if the curriculum is comprehensive and covers the standards in a well enough breadth of the standards, then they might recommend it primary and saying this would be great for core instruction, that this material meets all of the standards and objectives and is appropriate for core instruction. If they feel like it meets some of the standards but not all, then they'll recommend it limited. If they think it's just a resource that's helpful for a teacher, wouldn't necessarily be instructional material that you give students, then they would recommend it as just a teacher resource, something to help them to build their knowledge or their skills in the area to be able to advance their teaching. There's student resources as well, similar to if they think that would be most appropriate for student use to just deepen their understanding, then it's recommended for students. And then the final few are basically, it's either not recommended, they don't meet the standards, they're not in compliance with the law, or they're just something inappropriate in them for the students. Not sampled means we haven't completed the review or for the items that are incomplete. We just didn't review all those things, or not reviewed, they weren't assigned, or we didn't have an opportunity to review them, and we'll have to do that another time. So those are kind of the different criteria at which our Utah educators will determine recommendation levels for the materials that they're reviewing. Those then go into our instructional materials review database and are reviewed by staff. So our instructional staff, so if I'm over English language arts, once the English language arts educators review the curriculum that was submitted by the publishers and has been reviewed by the educators, then I as staff will go and review their reviews and do any additional checking, vetting of what they've recommended or suggested in their narratives that they've included as part of their reviews. Upon completion of that, then we go into step 3. So step 3 is when all those reviews, now that the Utah educators and staff have by statute, that Instructional Materials Commission is their main responsibility is to evaluate instructional materials, then to then send on to you for approval as a board. The membership that you can see of who's engaged in the instructional materials, again, that is defined in code. Those are the representatives on the commission who review all the materials and the reviews that we have done to be able to say, yes, we agree, or if they have any questions, they will send those to Alan as the staff present, and he will bring that back to the content liaisons. And we will have further discussion if the Instructional Materials Commission has any concerns or questions about the reviews they've received. So that is the step with the step 3. And next step, so let's say the Instructional Materials Review Committee is like, everything's been resolved, they agree with the recommendations. That will then come to the board for their review, as it did last month, and approval. So upon approval, once you guys have reviewed and say, yes, we agree, then we post those results of the reviews to our database and release those publicly, not only for educators, but also for the publishers to view. The final step is they've been out. There's a couple little steps in between that we'll talk about, but the final step is now they're public, they're ready for LEAs to use. As we discussed last time, some LEAs use our database as kind of their primary starting place, in which they say, what is the board reviewed and feels like it has a recommended status? And that is how they might narrow their curriculum search when they're going out and doing an RFP to find their science curriculum, for example. Some LEAs don't use the database at all. It's all based on local choice. Some have local boards that require them to use the database and some do not. So it's really just a service we provide to kind of narrow down the field of instructional materials, as in some content areas, there are lots to choose from, but just know that they've had that initial vetting by the state board to say they meet the standards and they are not out of compliance with state law. That's all our recommendations really get at. And then as the LEAs do their review is to really look at, does this fit our local context? Will this meet our teachers' needs? Will this meet our students' needs? Is there anything in the materials, the readings, the content of the actual materials that might be offensive or inappropriate for our local community? So with that said, there's a few key questions that have come up over the last month from board members that we thought would be helpful to address prior to opening for additional questions you may have. So the first question is, how does the rubrics that we use as part of the educator review attend to our 277328? How's that embedded? So specifically, there is a piece in the rubric that asks them, is the material bias free? And how that's defined, I'm going to read it to you, is materials must be free from bias and can be used by all students regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or disability, and is free from advertising, e-commerce, or political interest, and is in compliance with the law and community standards. So it's a very inclusive piece that we help the reviewers know what that means and looks like. Specifically, that rubric criteria is also in the rubric criteria the board has approved for staff when we're sharing curricular materials through email or other avenues. So the representation is really in that bias piece of the rubric to help them to realize, is this in line with our rules and laws related to bias and sensitivity to population. Question number 2, what happens if the publisher changes content without notifying USBE? So let's say the publisher has a digital content material that they could easily say, oh, we're going to swap out Unit 2 for this new curriculum, and what's the process? So the expectation is that if they change any content, that they have to submit notification to USBE for review. If it's a minor change and we look at it and feel like, yep, that's fine, then we accept that and we update the materials. If it's a more significant update, then we actually ask them to resubmit their materials. We don't do the review under the current review process. They will have to come back the subsequent year and actually ask for a brand new review, given the substantive changes to their curriculum. So if they don't notify us, might be a question you have in your mind. It's really great when they do, but if they don't and we find out about it, we have the right to take them off the website, cancel their contract negotiations that they have in terms of having a standard pricing available for the 5 years that they're on the database. And so we kind of remove them from the database to let our LEAs know they're no longer recommended from the state board, given we're not sure what content is in there. So it's really on the best side of the publisher to let us know so they don't lose their privilege of being in the database. Question 3, what does USBE do to notify publishers of new standards? So when publishers are doing their work, they're expected to align to our standards. So what we do is Alan will notify publishers that when we have new standards come out, so for example, social studies will probably be out this summer, we will do notification to all of our publishers who are registered with us that our standards have changed. Here are the new ones. And if they are going to submit a curriculum review for published materials that are addressing social studies, they will have to show that primary alignment to the new social studies standards as part of their submission. So that's our kind of one of our roles at the agency, is just to do the notification process. We have 1 to 2 standard sets a year that updates. And so we just notify our publishers that they have been updated, and in future submissions, they will have to be aligned with those new standards. Question 4, what if a publisher challenges their review outcome or another stakeholder? So we'll start with the publisher. When we publish our reviews, the publishers will look at them and they might have like, you didn't approve my curriculum. I really would like this re-looked at. I disagree. Let me give you more information on this item. They can kind of contest or appeal their review. And then that comes back to staff for additional review and consideration and whether that review gets redone, reconsidered, or it stands. If a stakeholder reaches out, let's say a community member or a teacher or a leader says, hey, we've got some concerns with this curriculum, and we've had this happen in my time as director, we then do the exact same thing we would do for a publisher. We go back in and we review those materials and see if there is need for concern and to adjust that review. So that's kind of the process there. And then finally is the our database. Like, where do you even find all the things for instructional materials? So this is as part of our MIDAS system, which holds our professional learning offerings. It holds our instructional materials review and also our micro-credentials. It's all kind of housed in this main place. But if you're interested in looking at the materials system and what it looks like, there is a link in this slide deck that we'll share with you after the presentation that you can dig into. I'm just going to show it to you for the sake of a quick preview. Once it opens, it's taking just a moment. My computer likes to heavily breathe, and that usually means it's going to shut down. So if it does, I apologize. And here is just what you can see for our review database. This is the landing page as you come into the instructional materials review. Right away, you start to see these recommendations. So we've got recommended primary. That means it covers all the standards, and we have recommended it as it would be an appropriate curriculum for LEAs to consider through their review process, and so on. So you'll just see, like SHMOOP, it has some parts that might be helpful to support the French language standards, but insufficient for covering all of them. So it has a recommended limited status. So just to kind of give you a quick view, if you actually click on them and you want to see the more detailed review, all of those details come up. Here's that rubric that folks filled out so we can see where the reviewers felt that it fell. And just a really easy way for LEAs to kind of start their search for new instructional materials based on reviews done by Utah educators. So with that said, I'm going to pause and hand things back to the chair. Chair, if you'd like, we'd be happy to answer any questions from the board.
You're on mute, Chair.
I thought it was me. Thanks, board member.
All right. Can I be heard? It shows I'm unmuted. Can I be heard?
Yes.
You can now, yes.
Okay, thank you. Member Hymas.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Thronson, for going over that review. I'd like to just, a couple of questions. First off, that list that I believe we're being asked to vote to award contracts to, is that the same list that we looked over last month and voted not to award contracts to?
Yes, no changes were made. We were asked as staff to leave it intact. We did go back and review, and I'll let Alan speak to that. We went back with staff and asked them to validate those recommendations one more time just to make sure we didn't miss anything. So Alan, do you want to speak to the process that we went through between this board meeting and the last?
Yeah, Alan.
Yeah, we called upon several specialists to go through their recommendations and make any corrections or additions or edits, or at least suggest them to us. And several of them did, almost all of them did. And so we have gone through and we have made some additions and corrections in certain places, not to invalidate what the reviewers did, but to make sure that they were accurate. There's a number of places where we did that, but I feel like the specialists gave their stamp of approval on what's there.
Follow-up.
Yeah, so help me understand if I'm hearing this correctly. This was brought to the board last month. There were some concerns with it, including we couldn't see the notes or what was commented on the books. Staff took it back, made no changes, but said, hey, put some comments in here. But I never saw them as a board member. So here I feel like I'm being asked to vote on something again that was voted down last month. And this time without seeing the progress, just saying, okay, well, we're going to ask for it again. I don't care for that personally. And I have some other questions, but I think that's the major overarching concern that I have.
Well, I would say in regard to the comments, I mean, as Jennifer indicated, I apologize, board. May I answer the question?
Well,
I'm already-
well, hang on one sec. We don't interrogate back and forth. Let me just ask, because this is where this direction is going. To Member Hymas's question or comments from the previous board meeting, and then also to here was in our policy and rule, there's nothing in there that says that the evidence of all of these boxes being checked and all these processes is part of some submittal before the board. There was questions last meeting about can we see them, or I haven't been able to see, I'm uncomfortable moving this forward because I want to see, and my takeaway from that was they want to see evidence that the process happened, not only the evidence, but notes and comments. And so now it's back before us again with this overview. And then as and this is a question for Dr. Thronson here, as I'm doing my comparable, I'm not seeing any difference in the list or the motion. And so, I mean, that's what I'm seeing before us. But to Member Hymas's question here to staff, I'm just trying to help move this on. He's wanting to see, I'm calling it evidence. Is that where you're, and I guess well, I'll go back to Member Hymas. I'm just trying to help couch your question of staff or what your expectation is.
Yeah, I think you're right on point, Chair, is that this was brought to us. We voted it down and asked for more information so we can see it. I personally was never shown any additional information, and now here I am asked to award contracts again. So how can I, in good conscience, 1 month say no, I need to see more information, and then this month say, yeah, okay, great work. And I'm sure there's a lot of work that has happened, and I'm sure it has been great, but we had asked and hoped to see some more information, and we haven't.
May I respond?
Chair, if I can respond. We don't have any specific required, like notes from the board meeting of what things you wanted us to look into other than to review the reviews, which we did. So we have to remember the steps in the process: publishers submit, educators review. Their review said to recommend those materials as we brought to you. Our staff reviewed as well. They reviewed a second time, and the Instructional Materials Commission has reviewed. So we have several steps in the process to do this work. So if there are specific things you would like us to look at with specific curriculum, we'd be happy to do so. But at this time, we have no hesitations as staff with the recommendations we're bringing to you today.
So let me just go back because of how the motion went. Member Hymas, the motion, I mean, there was a motion on the table. People were discussing what they liked, what they didn't like, their concerns, but there was never a motion that came from the body to say, I want a presentation different, or have it different. There wasn't a motion that gave direction that stated a change in the process, and I'm going to go to being a little more specific, because I think that's what your question is, Member Hymas, is that outside of process, you have Dr. Thronson and others saying that the steps were followed in compliance to rule and statute, and then the dialogue was, well, I'd like to see more, but the motion was to move it forward, and it failed to move forward. So the motion came back again while staff did their due diligence, which try to bring more surety that compliance, that the process was in compliance with what's rule and statute. And I guess there's a question for Director Thronson. Did I miss that? Or is that the
My
intent?
understanding, we were not requested any particular ones to do. Our review was to make sure the reviews we were going to come back to committee, and then we were changed to coming back to full board. So that's what we've done, is provided that overview of the process, as there were a lot of questions from board members of what was the process, how do we go about reviewing these materials so we can feel confident in the reviews that are coming out and the recommendations. And that is what we brought to you today. Like I said, we're happy to go and review particular curriculum materials that you have questions about, but we were not charged with that in the last board meeting.
So, and then I think Dr. Norman, I thought I saw a hand up and then not, but now I'm not. Oh, there it is.
Yes. Yeah, Chair Huntsman, you spoke articulately to what I was going to state. We actually went back and listened to that board meeting so that we were aware of what was being asked of us as staff. And so Alan and Jennifer were able to go back and listen, and that's how they created the PowerPoint that you saw today. The slide deck was formed after the questions were asked in board meeting. And so if there's more information, we can, of course, bring that back to you if needed. But Chair Huntsman, you spoke to what I was going to say.
Okay, well, just from being there and chairing at the point, those were the takeaways that I had when that motion fell, because those questions that were asked of members. But
Chairman, I'd respond.
Yes.
I went back and reviewed the recording of the board meeting twice, and I was aware of Board Member Hymas's concerns at the beginning. He illustrated that he was concerned with some of the social studies materials, as well as some of the health education materials. I had our health specialist go through through the process again and look carefully at all of the health education materials. And she was supportive of the reviews that were there. Now, I would say that the rubric itself has, several items that people can select from, and they're in some detail. It was the case that the people who reviewed the health materials decided to do their narrative in the evaluation section that is on top of the review. They did not respond to the narratives for the individual sections. Now, that was not required in the rubric as it is. I have asked our programmers that in the future that there must needs be a response in each of those narrative areas. Now, for the social studies materials, I found two items that were kind of sketchy in the way they were outlined. And I went back with some social studies specialists and updated those. And so there is narratives in those areas for social studies materials. Those were the two areas that I garnered that Board Member Hymas was concerned about. And those are the corrective actions that I took in that regard.
Okay. We got some other hands up here. We do not have a motion on the table, or this post presentation. Member Moss.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you. Yeah, I think there were several board members who raised concerns either from materials they'd reviewed or from parents of inappropriate material. And I saw some of that stuff. I went down through, and the stuff I know about is UEN. I don't know, frankly, where that fits in here, but there's some material in there that I understand we make available to folks, and it's couched in racial consciousness, and then it goes into sexually explicit material and how you can share it with kids. And that was just my particular rabbit hole. It took 2 clicks, which is about 5 seconds, I'm not hearing how those concerns were addressed. I know the protocols and the procedures were reviewed, but I think that was the nature of some of the problem, is whether the protocols are catching that kind of material. So I haven't submitted mine. I thought we might be hearing about, where is it that you're seeing inappropriate potential material. We're of course board members, but we're hearing this from parents and trying to pass it along and funnel it through appropriate channels. Was there or is there, an effort to look and see whether these protocols are catching some of the things that prompted those concerns in the last board meeting? I think I recall we did not give some specific motion, or instruction, but I think that was the nature of the concern. And I don't know that we've heard anything since the last meeting about, looking into those concerns that were raised. So if it's possible to address that somehow.
So, Member Moss, just so I understand your question was, but I tried to get something specific there, calling something out. You're talking about UEN or some other materials. I'm trying to be specific, but maybe before you, I think that's what you were saying or requesting or concern.
Mine was, yeah, mine, I haven't reviewed everything, but I understood UEN to be one that somebody raised a red flag. So I took a look at that, saw something problematic, but I seem to recall some other board members finding other problems. And I'm just curious if we had a chance to look into that stuff, or if not, if there's another way that the concerns that we raised last time can be.
Dr. Norman, can you respond?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Board Member Moss. The question that you're, let me clarify, is the UEN resources. And so what we're doing right now that Alan was in charge of is not the UEN resources, it was those that were being submitted by vendors for approval for the standards. And so that's what he has here. I know that Jennifer is driving on that. So that would be a different question than what we're doing in the Instructional Materials Center for review. These are just for an initial recommendation for the two areas that Dr. Thronson talked about. Do they align with the law and, the standards that we have? So when they align with those two things, then it's still up to the LEA to redo a final review, a complete and thorough final review, and have it approved with their board as well. So this is two different entities. So UEN would be something different. And Dr. Thronson, I can see that you're driving, and if you'll explain what that process looks like and how they're different, that Chair, if you would allow that.
Yeah, Dr. Thronson.
Yes, so UEN is not considered a publisher, so they do not submit their publications to USBE as part of the instructional materials review process. They are an independent entity who produces their own content and material, and USBE doesn't have authority over their materials at this time. So in terms of what we submit, there's no UEN content in these proposals that we have in front of you. And for the ones that were mentioned in board meeting last time, we did have staff, as Alan explained, review those materials again to see if they aligned with the standards and met law. And our staff did not find any issues at this time. That doesn't say that we looked at some of the materials we get have thousands of pages. And so our review is looking at what we can in those times. And then if the community, the LEAs are looking at it and saying, hey, we noticed this, what do you guys think? That's when we can go back through and review and remove. So it's, but the boards, the prompt today ahead of you is to approve the recommendations as we have for you today. If there are issues that people come across, there's nothing that requires us to leave it up as a recommended product. So if we find something that is disconcerting, we can go ahead and do another review and remove that material if we see fit at any time. We don't have any contractual obligation to leave those materials up if we find something that is alarming or disconcerting or doesn't align with the law or our standards. So with that said, hopefully that puts you at some ease and peace that we do have a process that if we do find things that are concerning, that we can deal with those in a timely fashion.
Member Moss, do you have a follow-up?
Well, just thank you. Thank you for the clarification. It's sometimes difficult to know whether districts can access the materials that we make available through the state and a state approved resource like UEN, whether that could go out to districts. And so, I don't know if others had specific issues, but what I'm hearing is that if we have, as board members, hear things and we have a specific place, it's typically tends to be online, I think, that we can send that to you, Director Thronson, and just say, hey, here's something we'd like to take a look at. Is that
Yeah, if it's something we've been promoting or we have in our RIMS database, that would be something we would want to know about if people have concerns. And we have a process built in for reviewing concerns as they come to us. We had a teacher last year. There was some social studies material that the reviewers had approved and recommended and had made it through the instructional materials, had made it through the board. And then they came back and said, hey, we noticed this. Our social studies specialist reviewed it and decided they were right. This material should not be recommended. And so we do have processes and procedures in place to remove content when those things come up.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, Vice Chair Belknap.
Thank you. So just for clarity, Alan, that it's on a 5-year review. We are reviewing content for law and to align with statute. To align with standards. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, Chair, I have a motion.
Okay. Please
I
continue.
gotta find it. I have to toggle. I'm working with one. Sorry, Chair, I didn't have this up.
You want me to, is it,
I've got it.
you got
I've
it?
got it. Okay, I move that the board adopts the recommendations by the Utah State Instructional Materials Commission and directs staff to award contracts to the various publishers to furnish instructional materials to the schools of Utah.
Is there a second?
Second, Lear.
Second. You want to speak to your motion?
I just want to say one thing, that I voted against this last time, but after spending time in this and this discussion today has given me much more clarity that this lands squarely on the backs of the LEAs to make this decision if they want to use these products that we have reviewed for those 2 items. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we have a discussion to the motion. Member Booth?
Just wanted to emphasize that what we are voting on is very clearly approving a group of resources that have been looked at, as Dr. Thronson said, in 2 very specific ways. Does it comply with the law, and does it speak to the standards that we have adopted in each of the content areas? That's it. We're not trying to say, okay, this is what you should do in the local area. We're saying it complies in these 2 areas, so review this in your local LEA. And they are the ones that are going to take responsibility for content and for the materials that will be then adopted by the individual school districts or charter schools or whoever. I'm so grateful for the work that is being done by USBE staff to actually make the effort a very huge and complex effort to review these materials, even to assert that, yes, they're in compliance with the law and they do speak to the standards that we have adopted. And I think it's such a wonderful resource. We need to be expressing gratitude. It's a help and an assist to those local folks who have to make the decisions in terms of adoption of the individual LEAs. So I'm fully supportive of our staff and the great work that they're doing, their thorough approach to this, and recognize that we're not expecting them to find every little detail that ought to be considered before an adoption at the local level. Thank you.
Member Earl? Jenny, Member Earl?
Yes, sorry, it's just taking me a minute to
Oh,
unmute
you're
here.
fine.
So I
There you are.
apologize. Just 2 questions now. I should have written them down. Question number 1, a couple of things. The UETN contents, and I know we're not talking about that today, but that does, by and large, that comes from us. So there should be vetting that takes place there before we put it up there. Not everything, but there is a lot of that. So that's just a side note. My other question is, if there is a content specifically that we wanted to look at, we've seen that, like, we may have read the comments and we'd like to look at the materials. Is there a way to do that? Are those accessible to a board member if they wanted to actually look at the content?
Dr. Thronson or Dr. Norman, one of the two of you, you have a response?
It's probably an Alan question, if you don't mind me deferring.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes, Board Member Earl, we make agreements with publishers to review the materials and to go in and look at the content very carefully. And that content is available for a certain period of time. The publishers obviously want to protect it so that it's not there for anyone at any given time. However, if there are any questions about the content from a board member, it's easy for me to contact publishers. I have a good relationship with them. And most of them have been very agreeable to extend the amount of time so a board member could go in and do that. I would have to make an arrangement within the database so that you'd have permission to do that. But it's certainly possible, and I'm sure publishers would be happy to extend the time so that you can do that.
Okay, thank you. I had another question.
While you're thinking of it, is there a form or a release that, Alan, that a board member would have to sign so that they're not taking that? I know that all those words are special and they've got dollar signs attached to them, and they don't want them going out to their other sources in some other way. Are they required to do any kind of
Not currently. And I would say that we have designed the database so it is protected, so that the only people who can go in and see the actual samples are the reviewers and the commission. But at any given time, I can extend permissions so that a board member could do that. And I guess I'm the gatekeeper, so to speak, as to who could go in and do that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Member Earl, I just thought it was.
Yeah, that's all right. Oh goodness, I should write these down. I get thinking, my brain does. I apologize. Oh my gosh.
Want me to come
The other
back?
comment, I had two other comments. I can't remember the one. Oh, my comment is when something comes out of our Instructional Materials Commission, and I'm not saying districts are not vetting it, but they're considering it usable. Does that make sense based on those recommendations? So while they probably go back through it a little bit, at the same time, they do rely heavily on those recommendations. And so and I know I'm not suggesting we don't take it serious or anything, but it certainly does carry a lot of weight for districts. And then the other comment has to do with one of the comments one of the items that was not recommended, which is the 1776 Unites, which is a compilation of stories from Black American history. While that may not align directly with our core, the stories in that particular narrative are very, they're powerful stories. So I don't know, I have a little bit of a concern that was considered not recommended when you go back and look at that information. Anyways, and I read through the comments of people that had vetted it, but it is interesting that it was not even considered as a possible resource, not as a primary. So anyways, those are my thoughts.
All right, thank you. I had Member Straight, but your hand's down now. Okay, Member Hymas.
Just quickly, I'm going to speak against the motion, just for the same purpose that I did last month, and that is my name goes on this. I have to answer for some of these as well when people reach out, and so I would love to have that access to see. I know that the staff has done work on it. I'm sure it's great work. I just love to see it so that when I say, yeah, I voted for that, or no, I didn't, there's a purpose behind that, instead of just saying, yeah, I voted for it. I don't know what it entails. I'm sure it's good, but that's why I'm speaking against the motion today, because I can't put my name on it yet. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. the motion before the board, and then we'll vote. The motion before the board is that the board adopt the recommendations by the Utah State Instructional Materials Commission and direct staff to award contracts to the various publishers to furnish instructional materials to the schools of Utah. Board members at this time, please vote. Okay, the motion passes and I have 4 no votes. That's member Hine, member Klein, member Earl, member Hanson. Is that how you see it, vice chairs?
What was the first name you said?
It's board member Hymas first.
Hymas, or member Hymas, member Klein, member Earl, member Hanson.
Correct.
Oh.
Okay, thank you.